This book is so popular, it's in fact sold out. So the publisher has sent us kindly a very good discount flyer, which you can grab right outside. And also, in addition to launching this important book, to remember the great work of the late Elia Zureik. This is needed work, I think, amidst genocide in Palestine, to say nothing of the violence dispensed by Israel in Zionism and in their name around the world, in Lebanon, in Syria and Yemen, on North American university campuses. That we can still have this kind of meeting here means we must. Our distinguished guests today are going to discuss Professor Zureik's life and work, so I'm not going to dwell too long on this intro, but I want to briefly introduce him, especially to our students and to the uninitiated. He was born in the ancient city of Akka. Sorry, I don't have a mic, but can everyone hear me? Yeah. Which lies on the Mediterranean coast of Palestine, between those ancient coastal cities of Jaffa and Sur, now separated by an artificial border of colonial vintage. He was born in 1939. That same year, his father, Tawfiq Zureik, published a short volume of English and Arabic proverbs for Akka's national press. The book featured a foreword by Ahmad H, a prominent local politician and religious leader, acolyte of al-Afghani and Abdu, and indeed the father of Ahmad H, first leader of the PLO. This collaboration speaks significantly, I think, to the ecumenical spirit that reigned over Akka before the catastrophe that befell Palestine scarcely a decade later, when Elia was just 9 years old. I won't speak too much more about Zureik's life. I'll only say that for more than 3 decades, Professor Zureik held court only a few miles from here at Queen's University, and in this way, he served as an important anchor for generations of Arab and Palestinian Canadians. As a scholar, Professor Zureik was always attuned to the world as it was, documenting the social reality of the Palestinian people. This approach is perhaps best exemplified in a short passage regarding the imperial political conditions that produced the Nakba and the ways those conditions have been obfuscated. It's a useful exercise in diplomatic history, he wrote, to put one document against another, usually emanating from the same source, and how the contradictory and irreconcilable nature of the statements made. Such an exercise will not take us very far. While we acknowledge the complex facets of the Palestinian problem, our intention is not to labor or reconcile opposing ideological statements. A saving device for us is to be able to look with hindsight at the actual developments in Palestine from Zionist colonization up to the present time. Actions, Zureik concludes, are the best indicators of intentions. Zureik was also a keen observer of colonial forms of knowledge. In an erudite chapter in his transformative volume, The Palestinians in Israel, A Study in Internal Colonialism, Zureik takes to task the ideological assumptions and structural basis of Israeli social science. One cannot help noting, he wrote, a remarkable degree of convergence between the Israeli elite's opinions concerning the Arabs in general and the images of the Arabs projected in academic research by Israeli social scientists. Zureik's study, which arrived to us in 1979, the same year as Ahmad Saadi notes in his chapter to this volume, as Edward Said's The Question of Palestine and Rosemary Sayer's Palestinians from Peasants to Revolutionaries. The book was a revelation. He brought to bear a theory of internal colonialism which traveled from Lenin and Gramsci, then on to Stokely Carmichael, James Boggs and the Black Panther Party, to the study of the Palestinian people in a powerful fashion. That same year, Zureik also offered an extended articulation of what a Palestinian method might look like. In an essay for the Journal of Palestine Studies entitled Toward a Sociology of the Palestinians, which some of my students read last semester, extended the following year with a volume edited alongside Khalil Nakhle. There, they wrote, in terms that may perhaps still serve us, that unlike Western-generated normal sociology, a sociology of the Palestinians is a native or indigenous sociology. It must be attached, committed, and action-oriented. It must anchor itself in the persistent re-examination and demystification of Western-generated conceptual frameworks towards groups, communities, and societies who do not subscribe to the dominant mode of thought. It's not merely a sociology of domination, but an analysis of methods and theories of dissolving domination. Elia Zureik demand a form of knowledge capable of contending with the present rather than serving status quo premised on dispossession from their land and their disappearance from history. Thus, they conclude, a sociology of the Palestinians at this juncture in history must be a sociology of radical socio-cultural change, however violent and abrupt it may prove to be. That being said, let me introduce today our distinguished guests. First, Areej Zureik, who I must mention sent some books on Palestine from the late Zureik's library to our encampment here last summer. And I will say also that Professor Zureik's work bears a strong mark of Areej Zureik's efforts, who traveled alongside Elia and the Palestinian cause since 1964. Every one of his works bears her mark, as Elia acknowledges in his 1966 master's thesis at Simon Fraser. Special thanks are due to my wife Mary, who spent her summer vacation typing the draft of this thesis. And special thanks are due from us to Mary as well.
You did do your research.
Second, I'd like to introduce Ahmad H, who's sitting here, an associate professor at the Department of Politics and Government at Ben Gurion University. He's the co-editor of Nakba, Palestine 1948 and the Claims of Memory with Layla Abou-Lughod, the author of Thorough Surveillance, the genesis of Israeli policies of population management, surveillance, and political controls towards the Palestinians, as well as co-editor of this excellent volume with Noor Masalha. His academic research has been published in 8 languages, including English, Arabic, German, Japanese, and Portuguese. He's been a visiting professor at the universities of Waseda, Tokyo, Japan, the National University of Singapore, Columbia University in New York, and a senior research fellow at the College of Social Science and Humanities at the Ruhr Alliance University in Germany. Third, Professor Areej Sabbagh-Khoury, who's joining us today via Zoom, was an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research interests include political and historical sociology as it applies to colonialism, indigenous studies, and memory. She's the author of the recently published Colonizing Palestine, the Zionist Left in the Making of the Palestinian Nakba, the first empirical study that carefully traces the process of the dispossession and displacement of rural Palestinians by kibbutz settlers in northern Palestine's Jezreel Valley before, during, and after 1948. It's based on research in 8 archives. Colonizing Palestine also examines the representation of colonial violence in the socialist discourse of the kibbutzim. She has published widely on settler colonialism, political sociology, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel in sociological theory, politics and society, theory and society, current sociology, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and other places, including in this book. She has a very important chapter that extends Zureik's analysis of internal colonialism. She's the recipient of research grants and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Palestinian American Research Center, Fulbright, the Council for Higher Education, all entities that no longer fund research as it happens. Sabbagh-Khoury is also a member of the General Assembly and Academic Research Committee of Mad al-Karmel, Arab Center for Applied Social Research in Haifa, where I first met Areej. She's also a member of Academics for Equality, and in May 2021, she founded the organization Emergency Line for students in the Israeli universities. And finally, we have a video message from Professor David Lyon, who couldn't join us here today, who also has a great contribution to the volume. He is Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Law at Queen's University in Kingston. Ironically, In view of Orwell's famed novel, he was first in touch with Elia Zureik in 1984, not knowing that he would become his colleague and co-researcher on several major projects from 1991. His best-known work is probably The Electronic Eye, The Rise of Surveillance Society, 1994, and his latest books are Pandemic Surveillance, 2021, Surveillance, a Very Short Introduction, and with Professor Zureik, he has co-edited Surveillance, Privacy, and Globalization of Personal Information, and Surveillance and Control in Israel, Palestine. Without further ado, Mary, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I just want to say that Elia did receive the announcement about this book before he passed away, but he did not receive the actual book. He was very pleased to know that his work has been recognized, and I'm sure if he were still here, he would be up here and I would be down there. But since I'm now up here, I get to tell stories that he would probably never tell if he were up here. I am not an academic. I'm going to tell you personal experiences that I think identify our path in life and Elia's beliefs and values. As was mentioned, he was born in Akka in 1939 to an Anglican father who was one of the first graduates of the AUB, and but had left Palestine for the United States as a draft dodger from the Ottomans in the World War I. He returned to Palestine in 1935. Elia's Greek Orthodox mother, although a member of a well-known family, was illiterate. Elia attended a Catholic school where his father taught, a government middle school with mostly Muslim students, and was admitted to a Jewish high school in Haifa. At the church where his father played the organ, Elia served as an altar boy at the 6 o'clock Mass. By his own reckoning, and I am sure this is true, Elia was a disruptive student, spending many hours in the hallway to the great anger of his father. He was good at math, but recognized at high school he was being trained to work in construction. And my personal experience was, fortunately, he was not in construction. He could not put a hammer to a nail all his whole life. His destiny was probably to be a teacher, which I don't think would have worked out very well either. His father passed away when he was 14. The extended families were in Lebanon and Jordan. Thankfully, neighbors helped Elia and his mother during those lean years. Uniquely in Palestine, he was the only surviving child, and his mother passed away when he was 18 or 19. But he had options and good fortune. He recognized his position as a Palestinian at that time. He had lived through the 1948 war. He was not a refugee, and he had a basic education and options. After his mother's death, the only real choice for Elia was to use his father's U.S. citizenship and take a ship, one of the last to disembark at Ellis Island. He settled in San Francisco, where he knew other families from his hometown. He was 20 years old. In those days, tuition was free at San Francisco City College. His guidance counselor took a special interest in Elia, found accommodation and a job at John's Pizza in a Russian Jewish neighborhood. I met Elia in the spring of 1964 at San Francisco State College, where he was majoring in mathematics and I was studying to be a teacher. Meeting Elia was my introduction to Palestine, 60 plus some years ago. He was so impressive. He could recite the Mass in Latin, knew Arabic, Hebrew, and English, one of the most intriguing persons I had met. We were married in December 1965 in the Unitarian Church, probably the only place that would have captured the whole essence of his background. We all have life's paths, and there will always be forks in the road where people don't know exactly where they're going to end up. But I'm going to list some of the options that Elia had. In the last year of college, he took an elective in political science and decided to complete 2 majors. He had joined the ROTC to earn money during his undergraduate years, and he could have been a navigator in the U.S. Air Force. But living with him for 50 years, I know he could not find his way around Kingston, Ontario. So I think for the people who was going to receive the bombs, they were very fortunate. His officer in charge of the ROTC was French and sympathetic to Elia's claim that he did not want to drop bombs on foreign lands, so gave him an honorary discharge. With the possibility of being drafted, we had applied to the Peace Corps and were assigned to Liberia and Africa, another fork in the road. With his master's degree, or with his math degree, he was offered a job at Boeing in Seattle. The owner of the pizzeria, where Elia had worked during his undergraduate years, had no children and offered to sell him the business. So you can see all the paths that we could have taken. But fortunately, he chose to move to Canada, where he was offered a teaching assistant position in political science, sociology, anthropology department at the newly established Simon Fraser University. June 1967, the reality of Palestine catches up. His knowledge and activist nature and abilities emerged, and with some anti-Zionist Jewish friends, they set up a table in the Quad to distribute information about Palestine. Hard work, fate, and how to bloom where you are planted. One of my favorite sayings, how to bloom where you are planted. He finished his master's thesis and moved on to get a PhD at the University of Essex in England. And in 1971 was offered a position in the new sociology department at Queen's University. Small town Ontario was not the place we had envisioned our life to unfold, but we were raising 2 children. I was ready to settle down and raise a family, but this is where all that came before us had coalesced and into Elia's academic contribution to the understanding of Palestine and the Middle East. We had a base in Kingston, but he used summers, sabbaticals, leaves of absence, retirement years to take on various projects in many Middle Eastern countries. During the 70s and 80s, Elia accepted projects in various countries. He would fly ahead, find housing for the family, and I would follow on long flights with 2 young children, beginning when they were 5 and 2 years old. I don't know if you've all had that experience. In those days, there were no cell phones or internet, only snail mail, or very expensive long-distance phone calls. None of us knew what to expect. Later, when the children were in school, he did find work for me, recognizing I would not be happy sitting in a strange apartment by myself. The first trip to the Middle East for the family was to Lebanon in 1974. Because of Elia's education and language skills in Arabic and Hebrew, he was invited to research materials that had taken from Palestine to Beirut, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. There's the term a beautiful mind. I am going to call Elia's a curious mind. He was always interested in the society in which people lived. He was also interested in education. For his PhD, he researched political attitudes of English children in grammar and secondary modern schools. And it resulted in journal publications as well as coverage in national newspapers. In 1975, he joined a British Arab consulting group in Iraq and spent the summer traveling through that country, recommending to the government the establishment of post-secondary schools with applied programs rather than more universities. You can see themes, but how he applied it to various locations. After spending the summer going up and down Iraq in the heat, he thought it would be a nice getaway and escape the extreme heat if the family met him in Beirut. but for a brief holiday. Neither of us had kept up on news about what was happening in Lebanon, although from experience a year earlier, we were not surprised. No one in Beirut could understand why we had turned up for a vacation, and we were told to leave ASAP. We got visas and left for Iraq, and 3 days later, Beirut exploded into full civil war. 2 years later, it was Riyadh. Elia compiled information on assessing educational qualifications for engineers who were coming from around the world to develop Saudi Arabia, something he knew nothing about. His suggestions were not taken seriously, so we left early and spent the year in Toronto. And each of these sentences and each of these paragraphs I could write a story about. Next stop, Kuwait. A 1-year teaching position at the University of Kuwait to teach sociology. Each morning after the school bus picked up the children, we drove the 39 kilometers to the campus from our neighborhood, which I viewed as the Palestinian ghetto. That was a fascinating neighborhood. Again, I could write a lot about it. Kuwait did provide education, and the Palestinians soaked it up, knowing education was their investment for future survival, and we all know that, and I'm assuming that everyone is reading between the lines here. School buses started picking children up with their school bags at 6:30 a.m. 12 hours later, the last children from the 3-shift school programs were left off. No flicker of television showing in apartment windows, just lights for children doing their homework. The parents were building that country as teachers, doctors, editors, newspaper editors. But Kingston continued to be our home base. And the papers and notes he had shipped from Beirut in 1974 and information collected over the years were scattered on a table in our attic that lacked insulation or air conditioning. Elia typed 2 fingers on a Smith Corona typewriter that we had lugged around since our time in California and sent the transcript for publication. Even during the 1970s, Elia did not talk about his research on Palestine until he had gotten tenure. In 1979, Elia's groundbreaking book was published, The Palestinians in Israel, A Study in Internal Colonialism. By then, our children had experienced the Middle East and Palestine, and we always remember our 10-year-old son's comment, "Shouldn't that be the Israelis in Palestine?" New directions. That was one stage of his life. I am not an academic, but I do remember the beginning of Elia's interests that developed into major areas of research. He became interested in surveillance very early in the 1980s, beginning with telephone workers being monitored at their workplace. Surveillance became a major topic of interest and fed into, as you realize, all the significant publications that he has published, and it is even more relevant today. Despite knowing the downside of participation, he was part of the Canadian team working on the refugee issues during the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. No matter that he started cautiously with family reunification, Palestinian refugees inside Israel, and refugees from the West Bank, not 1 inch was given by the Israeli negotiators. Sometime during the 1990s, a group, and it'll be in this book, worked on independently digitalizing UNRWA records. My first action after October 2023 was to contact one of his colleagues, and that is Salim Tamari, to ask where those were kept. And I think they're up in the cloud somewhere. So people who are doing research, there are records. After the 1990s, when the children were in university, we continued to travel. Elia always found a job for me working in the universities, copy editing, research papers, etc. I somehow also made sure I attended as an observer at the many conferences and meetings held over the years in Cyprus, Germany, Israel, Gaza, Amman, etc. I sat behind him at the Council of Foreign Relations in New York City, as well as in the principal's office of a Bedouin's boys' school in the desert of Sharjah, while he interviewed the students. I have seen a lot sitting where you are. Over the years, Elia and I discussed the before times. And we came to the conclusion that after we left a place, it would blow up. Beirut and the Civil War beginning in 1975, the Israelis' invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the research material in Beirut was taken by the Israelis and I believe are at the Hebrew University or another institute in Jerusalem. Lebanon continues to be destroyed, same with Kuwait in 1990. In 2000, we lived in Ramallah for 6 months. We left in August, and in September, there was another intifada that erupted, number 2 or 3, I don't remember. And then Iraq, there was such possibilities in that country, it too has been destroyed. So in his retirement years, still interested in education, we spent a year in Sharjah, UAE, 2005 to 2006, where he was curious why women did better in school and studied longer than men in most conservative emirates. Again, the curious mind, his observations. And it was a very interesting result. In 2015, he was invited to assist in the establishment of the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies. The aim was to have Western-educated Arab professors adapt their knowledge to the Middle East. Students from Arab-speaking countries were given a full scholarship to learn in their own language and critique concepts that might help develop their own countries. The future. Elia passed away in January 2023. Various people have said in sympathy, "Aren't I glad Elia's not here to see what is happening?" And it's true. He would have been especially horrified with the destruction of educational structures, UNRWA, schools, the 5 universities destroyed in Gaza, and the destruction in the West Bank. But on the positive side, I know he would be very pleased to see the next generations of Palestinians claiming their heritage and resisting occupation, and with others in solidarity exposing the false narratives many in the West have taken as truths. Now, our son bought this mug recently, a couple of years ago. It says, "I'm not yelling, I'm Palestinian." Now, you will notice I did not become emotional, I didn't talk. And I'm going to say, in this cup are my tears, my frustrations, my anger, my hopes for the future, and I toast all of you to take up some part on your life's journey to do something about what is happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary, for sharing that with us.
Personal experience.
Ahmed, if you don't mind, I'll put Areej next, and then we'll go here. I'm just gonna turn this on.
Here. أريج تقولي إشي بس نتأكد السمع.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. You see the first one with the book cover that Ahmed and Noor edited?
Yes. شايفين.
Shukran. Thank you. Hello, and thank you all dearly for your attendance today. Thank you to Ahmad Saadi and Noor Masalha for the invitation to contribute to this important volume. And thank you, Asmat, of course, for allowing this gathering. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person in Canada. But as you know, the current travel situation back into America is becoming more and more precarious for scholars. I ran away from Israel and I am facing another difficulty here. I'm so sorry about that. I was so thrilled to be invited to contribute a chapter to Decolonizing the Study of Palestine, Indigenous Perspectives and Settler Colonialism after Elia Zureik. As a young undergraduate Palestinian student studying sociology at an Israeli university, reading the work of Palestinian scholar and sociologist Elia Zureik was constitutive and inspiring. His was among the first rigorous sociologies of domination I read that offered an analytical approach to explaining state-society relations in Israel through an anti-hegemonic lens, the framework of internal colonialism. This was revolutionary to me in the hegemonic spaces of Israeli academia. To experience the impact of Zureik's work on my own thinking was also to first realize that I too, as a Palestinian student, could make it my life's work to study Palestinian life, including that Palestinians in Israel, carefully and methodologically. Elia Zureik modeled for me the way to study socio-political life in Palestine, while also being dedicated to a broader nomothetic pursuit, the study of power, governance, and violence writ large. Through my own interactions with Elia, he also modeled how one can teach and communicate with the next generation, facilitating, in Edward Said's words, the permission to narrate for a young female scholar such as myself. So, before I move to my talk, I want to offer my thanks to dear Elia for exemplifying what it means to be a Palestinian sociologist, for being an inspiration as I sought to follow in his footsteps, and for the knowledge his work continues to share with the world, in hopes of engendering a more just and decolonized future for Palestine and Palestinians. My chapter, The Paradox of Settler Colonial Citizenship in Israel, builds on Zureik's work by analyzing how citizenship operates within settler colonial state-making. I center on Palestinians in Israel, with a particular focus on Palestinian internally displaced refugees, those who, despite being forcibly displaced, remained in their homeland and were subsequently designated by the state as absentees and internal enemies. Citizenship is not neutral, but shaped by political struggles that classify groups and distribute rights unequally. In settler colonial contexts, it serves as a mechanism of accumulation by disposition, entrapping indigenous peoples within institutional structures that limit decolonial action. Yet, it also provides baseline protections for their continued presence. This dialectic, both constraining and enabling, allows for new scrutiny of the interplay between state policies and indigenous agency. My analysis stemmed from interest in the particular social position of Palestinian citizens in Israel, who, among the Palestinian population writ large, found themselves uniquely subject to the state that manages their affairs, whom Elia belonged as well, but he left. For those unaware or made to be leaving, for those unaware, upon the British withdrawal from Mandate Palestine and the establishment of Israel in 1948, the vast majority of those indigenous inhabitants of Palestine, Palestinian Arabs, were displaced beyond the 1949 armistice borders, becoming refugees. Approximately 156,000 Palestinians remained in what became to be known as Israel. Out of this population, approximately 30% were classed as internally displaced persons, meaning they remained within the new state borders, but not in their original villages and their original houses in the Palestinian cities. The vast majority also refused offers for compensation and have still insisted on return. This group experienced ethnic cleansing long before 1948, as I discuss in Colonizing Palestine. Uprooted and witnessing their population's disintegration, some were exiled and later returned. Their presence, concentrated in the north, posed a dilemma for Israel, which aimed for exclusive Jewish sovereignty over maximal contiguous territory. While declaring itself democratic, Israel granted them citizenship, referring to them as full and equal in its declaration of independence. This complicated over discrimination, as citizenship typically used to enforce exclusion, paradoxically offered a form of inclusion that clashed with the state's goal of eliminating the natives as natives. For nearly 2 decades, Israel subjected about 90% of Palestinian citizens to martial law. As I explore in my writing, settler states where non-native colonial settlers dominate an indigenous minority face deep tensions in their partial incorporation of this disenfranchised group. A key paradox in Israeli citizenship system was its simultaneous colonization through forced territorial redistribution and its prevention of the refugee return. I will mention one pragmatic example: the emergency regulations of 1948 and the absentees property law of 1950 were the primary mechanisms of legalized dispossession by the state in its early years. The law authorized the custodian of absentees property to manage property deemed absentee and expel individuals residing on it. The state was considered the owner of these properties unless the absentee owner could prove their status was not that of an absentee. This enabled the state to appropriate and nationalize vast amounts of land and property. Notably, many of internally displaced refugees were subject to this institutionalized disposition. One case, for example, is that of Safuri village. These inhabitants were uprooted from their village, tried to return, were exiled again, and most ultimately relocated to Nazareth, where they overlooked their displaced Palestinian village. Today, Safuri stands there as Tzipori Moshav and Park, which appropriated its lands. What I seek to establish in that settler colonial citizenship is defined by the history of native dispossession and subjugation. Citizenship, nearly all settler colonial cases show, does not indemnify historical violence merely through the extension of membership and liberal rights, but neither are indigenous subjects merely passive recipients of state power. Settler colonial citizenship regimes across contexts demonstrate elements of, first, settler domination, assimilation, elimination, and second, variable native strategies of acceptance, refusal, negotiation, and preservation. My core argument is that relations between the settler and the indigenous groups are to be viewed as property relations. The dialectic of dispossession accumulation is expressed in the political realm in terms of citizenship, and consequently, citizenship itself becomes a form of property available to one group at the expense of hollowing it out from the other group. In our case, to the Jewish national group at the expense of the Palestinian national group. Accumulation by disposition works precisely as it sounds. Disposition for one becomes the basis of the accrual of valued goods and resources without the process of exchange. In Israel, like other settler colonial contexts, and I think it also applies to Canada, it has been a combination of the state and its settler citizens who began benefiting from the uneven interaction. The citizenship of Palestinians in Israel acquires a broad, both pre-legal and legal base. I thus seek to combine the materiality of land with the legal classificatory framework of citizenship, which legalizes the rights to possess it. Accumulation by disposition needs not to take the form of capitalist privatization. In fact, its Zionist version preferred a collectivist, avowedly socialist approach. Furthermore, the citizenship under discussion has a liberal character. In this fashion, and notwithstanding its liberal and socialist features, it is bifurcated. The case of internally displaced refugees highlights this paradox. They received Israeli citizenship, but lost their houses and their lands. Though they never left their homeland during the 1948 Nakba, they were displaced and labeled present absentees. Politically, I would claim present, but absent for property rights. Population control policies prevented their return, while military rule continued the process of disposition. For Palestinians, citizenship remains unfulfilled, lacking full liberal and collective rights. They reject it as path to integration, but see it as a crucial to remaining in their homeland. While citizenship serves settler colonial domination, it also has been a tool for anti-colonial resistance. Palestinian citizens actively assert their claims, shaped by mediating institutions that structure their political engagement. Most prominently, the internally displaced refugees long tried to return to their homes and villages, attempting to bypass the state when possible, but even petitioning the courts at a later point, such as in the case of Iqrith and Bir'am. For decades, these two villages, inhabitants have been resisting ethnic cleansing by returning, holding festivities, burying the dead, attending church, and more. This way, they also continued their relation to the land. In the case of Bir'am, though, for instance, Kibbutz Bir'am and its property possessions serve as a reminder of the inextricability of disposition and accumulation between the settler state and its settlers' citizens. I'm not talking about the settlers in 1967 just. I'm talking also about 1948 citizens, Jewish settlers. Additionally, the IDPs, or the internally displaced refugees, memory practices perform an active refusal to forget the foundational violence in the Nakba and to assert the continuity of Palestinian baqa, which means the remaining in the home and in the homeland. Palestinians have practiced symbolic return to destroyed villages, or for younger generations, those of their ancestors. In the first years of the military rule, Palestinians visited, temporarily returned to their displaced villages on Israeli Independence Day. The only day they were permitted to move without permits. This return continues today. In the wake of the Kufr Qasim massacre in 1956, the Land Day commemoration in 1976 took off as a popular practice of social protest against domination, conceptually refusing the erasure of the state constitutive violence from Palestinian and Israeli consciousness. In 1998, Areej, the Association for the Defense of the Rights of the Internally Displaced, started to organize the Return March, choosing a different destroyed Palestinian village as each year's destination. The marches, which seek to bring the displacement of the Palestinian from their own towns to the forefront, took place on the actual Israeli Independence Day in order to remind the Israelis that your day of independence is our day of Nakba. Their political and cultural political activism reinvigorate of new political meaning to the 1948 foundational violence. These two pictures, the last two pictures, were from different two marches. Furthermore, a main focus of the Palestinian citizens' struggle within Israel has been the acquisition of full citizenship, which would require that the state of Israel be transformed from a settler state into a state for all of its citizens. One of the most significant Palestinian political projects challenging Israel's exclusionary nature was the push for the state for all of its citizens, advocating for citizenship rights. The National Democratic Assembly, التجمع, founded in the late 90s, sought to democratize Israel's settler colonial system through a liberal democratic framework. However, this approach also revealed the paradox of engaging within a system designed to privilege one group. Palestinian resistance has never been unified, and despite its influence, the Tajammu or the NDA's vision struggled to gain traction. It remains underrepresented, failed to enter parliament in the last election, and faces state repression, with its activities deemed subversive by the Israeli authorities. These practices present just a few forms through which Palestinians redrew the boundaries of citizenship, even under conditions of domination. The classification the state ascribed to Palestinian, the citizenship, has become the grounds for their struggle against the legitimacy of colonization and the institutions erected to perpetuate it. Citizenship, in one sense, is held as a strategic asset for anti-colonial social movements. I find across most mobilization against state domination, the cultivation of what I call habitus of sumud, or habitus of steadfastness, a cultivated set of dispositions, learned habitus, embedded understandings, and the skill set of navigating the violences of domination, wherein Palestinians have phenomenologically encountered and learned ways of living amid frequent violence. By linking together territorial disposition typical to settler colonies with the political configuration of citizenship, I give the former a legal and the later a material dimension. I highlight the conversion of citizenship into a form of privileged and therefore bifurcated and discriminatory status. I attempt to combine elements from comparative settler colonial approaches using Elia's also framework to construct a solid theoretical foundation, simultaneously by foregrounding the Palestinian in general and the internally displaced refugees in particular, specifically in Israel, as understudied group. I try to revisit the experience of the Palestinian in Israel who continue to work to transform the settler state and to democratize and decolonize it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sabbagh-Khoury. Now, Professor Ahmad Saada will join us.
يعطيك العافية أحمد، آسفة ما قدرتش أنضم.
ولا يهمك. Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending, and thank you for the organizers, and particularly to Asmat for inviting me to this discussion, to participate in this forum. I want to begin by highlighting 2 points. The first point is probably the map that you saw on the cover, on the book's cover. This map was drawn by the Arab geographer Al-Idrisi, and Columbus unfortunately used this map. In fact, the map was a collection of maps, not a single map, but we took one of that map, which Columbus used to discover America. Interestingly, in that map, there is a place for the for America, but he was not sure what is there, and he just made a draw that there is something there which he was unable to see or to visualize. And in that map, the word of Palestine is written with the names of several Palestinians, towns and villages, including Acre. And therefore, when Americans ask about where is Palestine, have Palestine been a state, or these kind of questions, we can always come with the map to see that the map for discovering America, in fact, mentioned Palestine and the various cities of Palestine. The second point on which I shall elaborate is the question of decolonization. What is decolonization? Do we need a knowledge of decolonization? And nowadays in the academia, we have a lot of decolonization. Everything, it seems, needs a decolonization. Decolonizing Weber, decolonizing mathematics, decolonizing Einstein, and so on and so forth. We are into this mood of decolonization. And the question is, what is decolonization? What do we mean by decolonization? And decolonization on the basic level is a kind of critique. But what is the difference between critique and decolonization? There are various levels of critique. The first level of critique, of course, if we bring different facts, we can show that the facts that were brought were not correct or not appropriate, and we bring other facts. Another or more radical critique would be critique of the presuppositions that the whole paradigm was in fact built on false presuppositions, on false assumptions. The first level of critique, of course, is paradigmatic shift, which Kuhn and others spoke about, when we accumulate a lot of data to show that existing paradigms do not work. But decolonization, I think, is one step further. For that, to explain that, I'll refer to Martin Heidegger, and Heidegger said, we conceive the world as a picture. And decolonization, when we prove or when we illustrate that the pictures that we have of the world is false, is untrue, or inaccurate, probably we better look on another way. We should turn our heads on a different direction. And that is decolonization. It's not just a critique, but to see the whole picture of the world is incorrect. In fact, one American congressman was right in saying that the problem with the social media is that they are changing the narrative, as if we can't hold on to our narrative, to the picture of the world and our classifications of good guys and bad guys. The bad guys are not, after all, that bad, and the good guys are certainly not good enough, or not good enough, or not good. Decolonization, if we conceive it this way, has been underway for a long time. We can look at the work of Karl Marx, Fanon, Sartre, Du Bois, and others as a decolonization of colonial perspective, or the colonial picture, how colonists tried to make us view and see the world. Of course, Michel Foucault, in the last period, despite his politics and everything, in fact, he provided some tools for decolonization by stating that facts are regimes of truth. After all, we accept that this truth, and this truth is not forever, but also that power is aligned, knowledge is aligned with power. And therefore, we should look at the power which undergirds, which supports this kind or that kind of knowledge. And we see that today at American universities in a clear way. But what is the picture that the colonizers created for the world? We say we want to decolonize the colonial paradigm, but what is the colonial paradigm? Windsor and Matheson, in fact, pinpointed the three principles of that paradigm. The first one is that the West, only the West, can develop in an autonomous way, progress in an autonomous way without foreign input into Western culture and Western civilization. And that for various reasons. Max Weber, I said about decolonizing Weber. Max Weber tells us that the West was able to progress because of the Protestant ethics. And his thesis about the Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism, of course, is known. And a lot of people, until recently, argued that Asian societies cannot develop because they don't have the Protestant ethics. Other factors include, or other explanation for the exclusivity of the West is, of course, the race theory, which were dominant in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. But also there is a recent argument for that, which was put forward mainly by Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis, which is the Judeo-Christian civilization. The second factor of that picture is that other societies, of course, cannot develop by their own, and they need, for a push from outside, or they need a tutelage, a kind of a higher grade race or people to try to help these societies to progress and develop. And even Karl Marx was part of that. We spoke about Marx as decolonizing, but Marx also was influenced by this type of argument when he spoke about the Asiatic mode of production. And if we remember that Marx said that Asian societies cannot develop by their own, and they need colonialism to push them to shake up these stagnant societies, and in order to enter the development of history. Marx said that Asian countries or Asian mode of production, these societies are outside the dialectics of history. And he spoke about modes of production, and he left aside the Asian mode of production because it likes dynamism. The second thing is that the transfer of ideas and the transfer of knowledge from the natives to Europe is, in fact, the ideas are either old or harmful. And there is a lot about the harmful implications of incorporating local knowledge. The knowledge should be based on Western knowledge, and only Western knowledge could explain the world. Therefore, they need our help, they need our education, and they need our faith. Therefore, we should try to help them to alleviate their position. I made a lot of research about Israel, but after many years, I discovered that the Zionist narrative is, in fact, there is nothing unique in it. It's just copy of European ideas of colonialism. After all, it's just adaptation of European ideas or of the colonial picture of the world, and they want to be part of that. We are part of this image of this picture of the world. And they, in fact, they use what they call modernization theory. Israelis are part of the Western, democratic, civilized, enlightened world, and these barbaric natives that we should either enlighten them or should we tame them and their barbaric environment. Three principal arguments are there or constitute the Israeli narrative. The first thing is that they came to an empty, barren land. There were either no Palestinians or the Palestinians were just small groups of violent tribes. And in fact, Shimon Peres, who received the Peace Prize, Nobel Prize, said, the land to which they, the Zionist settler, came, while indeed the Holy Land was desolate and uninviting, a land that has been laid waste, thirsty for water, filled with the swamps and malaria, lacking natural resources, and in the land itself lived another people, a people who neglected the land but lived on it. Indeed, the return to Zion was accompanied by ceaseless violent clashes with the small Arab population, when the Zionists and non-Zionists were mere 7% of the population. And in fact, when the Balfour Declaration was given, the Jews were 7% of the population. So the first thing is that the land was desolate, and there were natives, and these natives should concede their land. In the United States, we know that the right of the white man to buy overrides the right of the native to sell. If white people want to buy a land, the natives should sell. And if they don't sell, there is the Trail of Tears and other things that we learned from that knowledge. But this is also a self-fulfilling prophecy, that if the land is not empty, we should make it empty by doing away with the population. And in fact, the French historian Pierre Nora says, what characterized these settlers is that their apparent high culture and the way they present themselves as friendly, as cultured, as civilized. But he says that beneath this level is in fact used as used to hide beneath it the deep drive and desire to massacre and to do away with the natives. In fact, the desire for genocide is part and parcel of the settler colonists. And in fact, we saw that in America. We saw that in Australia when the British aristocrats went for hunting tours and hunting of not exactly of the wildlife. And we saw that in Gaza. Therefore, what is going on in Gaza is not just as a result of a war. In fact, an Israeli sociologist and who was a general in the army, Yagil Levy, wrote an article in Haaretz and saying that what's going on in Gaza, it was not done by these religious fanatics, settlers of the West Bank and so on, but in fact by the culture, the civilized commanders, the socialists, the liberal, the European. They are the ones who want these things to happen and to take place. So the second one is making the desert bloom. And the third one is modernizing the natives. We should help the natives. The natives should be helped, should be modernized. But after many years, these natives refused to be modernized. In fact, always when we discuss with Israelis, they say no oppression, there is equality, Israel is a democratic state, and so on and so forth. And they call the oppression of the Palestinians gaps. There are always gaps. Why there are gaps in the educational attainment between Jews and Palestinians? And they say the gaps are due to the Arab culture. These are not able to come to terms with the modern world. And in fact, the top Israeli scientist, political scientist, and he was an important guy who developed theories. In fact, he wrote about Marx, the early work of Karl Marx and so on. His name was Shlomo Aviner, and he was a senior advisor to Israeli governments and so on and so forth. And he writes the following: the Arab society is a truly a Baroque society where manners and style, facade and imagination are all the outgrowth of an overripe culture. Such society may have greater difficulty in coming to terms with the modern world than a pure tribal primitive society of the African variety. Therefore, these Arabs are Arabs. The former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir said, "The sea is the sea and the Arabs are the Arabs." Okay, well, and Israel is modernizing. They did not expel Arab. They came to modernize, to work the land, and they have the right to work the land, and they came to help the natives, and the natives were unthankful, and so on. And we come now to the question: what did the Palestinians do? What Palestinian scholarship was about? In fact, from the beginning, there was Palestinian scholarship, but nobody wanted to hear. Spivak wrote famously her famous article, "Can the subaltern speak?" But in fact, can he be heard? Or is there anybody who is interested in hearing the voice of the natives, of the Palestinians? In fact, the Palestinians were telling everybody not to look at that picture, but to turn their head and to look at a different picture, totally, radically different picture. And therefore, nobody wanted to hear, nobody wanted to look at the facts. I think that the major shift occurred with Edward Said's book, Orientalism, 1978, and it was the first, the major study that disproved or that falsified the whole colonial narrative. And a year later, within a year, 3 books were published: Edward Said's The Question of Palestine, Elia, Palestinians in Israel, a study in internal colonialism, and Rosemary Sayegh, Palestinians from Peasant to Revolutionaries. And by Elia, I remember when his book was published, I just began my studies at the university, and I remember the uproar, the hate speech at that book. And when the foremost Israeli sociologist, Baruch Kemmerling, wrote about the book that this is a war by other means. And he asked, why did Elia wrote this book? This book is not going to help the Palestinians. We are helping the Palestinians, and that book will not be beneficial, will not bring any worthwhile contribution to the Palestinians. By the way, later on, he withdrew his criticism of Elia's book, and he invited Elia to give a presentation at his university and so on. Okay, I want to discuss or to look at the question of settler colonialism, which is also one of the main concepts used now to discuss the question of Palestine. And I think that history of ideas as a discipline is quite interesting in helping us decolonizing the concepts and the word picture that we have in mind. In fact, this concept, settler colonialism, was used first by the Zionists themselves. Haim al-Lazarov, I think he was Max Weber's student, and he said, we are just like South Africans. We should learn from South Africa. Look at the experience of the settlers in South Africa and learn from that experience. And Arthur Robin, in fact, Arthur Robin also, he was a student of Max Weber, a quite successful student of Max Weber, and he came to Palestine, and in fact, his job was to implement the colonization of Palestine. He was a student of Max Weber, particularly the organizational side, and he worked on that. And he adopted settler colonialism, but also the whole idea of racial superiority of the white race. And in fact, he was when he was dying, he was looking at pictures of various races and trying to validate his conception of race. But anyway, he also looked at Max Weber's work, and in fact, Max Weber used the word settler colonialism, I think, in his either thesis or rehabilitation. I think rehabilitation. In Germany, you have to write another PhD after the one you receive, which is called rehabilitation. And I think he did that for his rehabilitation about the eastern parts of Germany. He said, Max Weber famously said that the land is colonized by inferior race, by the Slavics, by Poles and Russians, and we should recolonize it. And he spoke about the theory of settler colonialism. It came from there. Later on, the Zionist, or the picture that they try to create is that we are not settlers, we are not foreign to the land, we are not settlers, and settlers does not apply to us. Then the concept was dialectically used by Palestinian scholars, by Faiz Saigh and by Ibrahim Abu al-Lughad and Abu Laban, wrote about settler societies in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And in 1973, Maxime Rodinson wrote his famous book, Israel, a Settler Colonial State. The concept disappeared for a while, but then was reintroduced by Vercini and Wolff, the beginning of the 21st century. And I think we should look at the concept, the use of the concept now, how it is used. And I think that, as Leila Abu Lughad wrote, that this concept lost its intellectual power. In fact, it was used at the beginning by the Palestinians as what the Marxist theory called the praxis, which means to combine together ideas with action. Now it's more like an analytical tool, and I think we should look at that concepts should not be divorced from practices of our practices in daily life. Then in 1987, Uri Davis wrote a book called Israel an Apartheid State, and Uri Davis, in that book, he says that, in fact, Israel is far worse than a settler colonial state, because settlers sometimes, like in South Africa, settlers wanted to use the natives, and he said that the case in Israel, the idea or the intention is to eliminate the natives. I think that now, or at least in the past, since the publication of Orientalism in the past 4 decades, that there has been a lot of work to demystify the colonial picture of the world. Nobody look at the colonial picture of the world as credible. We have an alternative picture which is more credible. When we look at visualize the world in our minds, the more I would say the more credible picture that we envision is what is going on in Gaza, what is going on here and there. All of us saw that lives, unfortunately, sometimes. So where we go from here, I think that decolonization of the knowledge of Palestine and other, in Palestine and in other places has largely succeeded, thanks to the work of a lot of the first generation of Palestinian and other scholars that nobody wanted to hear from them. Nobody wanted to debate their ideas or to discuss their ideas. They were marginalized, put aside, but eventually their effort, their work has won out. And I think what is going on in the campuses in the United States and in other places is the best illustration, the best proof that there is a decolonization of knowledge. When they introduce these severe measures in American universities, in Columbia, for example, the teachers are not allowed to teach. They supervise the teaching of Middle Eastern studies, and in other places. I think in New York University there was an opening for Edward Said chair, and they abolished that position. And I think the governor ordered the university to abolish that position and to freeze all the procedures regarding hiring staff for that position and so on. This is exactly the proof that decolonization has been successful. Hegemony, Gramsci and others tell us, hegemony works through a combination of power and persuasion. And people use power when persuasion no longer win the battle over the hearts and minds. And I think the battle of hearts and minds, in a certain way, has been won to a certain degree by the Palestinians. Nobody look at the Israeli narrative as credible nowadays, and even the American, despite the support that Israel gets from the ruling class in all the Western countries, and the media, the print media, Washington Post, New York Times, and so on, and the televisions, and the cables, and CNN, and other outlets. Nobody believe in their narrative. Nobody believe in the way that Professor Yasmin Abu Laban, who is in the advisory board of the group of Hearing Palestine, she said that they want us to believe that we are not seeing is not true. If you see something, you shouldn't believe your mind. And she used the term gaslighting to describe the kind of a psychological process in which you try to prove the people that what they are seeing is not the truth. Rather, the truth is what is told by others. And I think the universities now are in that stage of losing. The universities are unable to stand for freedom for speech, for what the universities stand for. What is the university? The university, I believe, is built on the principle that the pen is mightier than the sword. But we see that the sword has been able to break the pen, particularly that the universities has become corporations rather than places for contemplation, for free discussion and free debates. Another thing which I think it's worrying for me that we are returning to the late medieval periods where the Inquisition, where people were not were persecuted for their ideas and beliefs, and this is what we see at American universities. The students said something or shared a post a year ago or 2 years ago, they are kidnapped in the streets and sent to detention centers and so on. And just like the Inquisition, fortunately they don't kill the people yet, which is a bit assuring, but at least the treatment that these people get is quite horrible. And I think we are returning to the late Middle Ages, where people are persecuted where nobody can defend his ideas, nobody can defend his beliefs. And it is unfortunately dark times, and the people who have a privilege, the people who have the privileges, the people who have the power want to retain that, and they don't want their perceptions and their privileges and their picture of the world, which justify their position, their power, is established on. They don't want any challenge, and they use, when they failed in the battle over the hearts of minds, they return to use the force. And Carl Schmitt, in that context, said that we should always be vigilant, because under the normalcy of liberal values and democracy and rights and so on, there is always the danger of exceptionalism. And I think what's going on in the United States is a state of exception, where the president signed all kinds of decrees, and these decrees he and the foreign minister and others use to harass people, to imprison people, to expel people from the country, people who have green cards and so on and so forth. And therefore we are in a moment where the dialectics between the colonial picture of the world and decolonization reach a critical moment. Those who have this picture, the colonial picture, don't want to give up, while the unraveling realities show the opposite. The people no longer believe in their ideas, and they in fact use force. And force there is a last option. And as things goes on, I am afraid that we are heading to fascist dictatorial regimes of the worst forms or worst kind. And I hope I am mistaken. Well, thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Saada. We have one extra video message from Professor David Lyon, who couldn't be with us today, but was kind enough to record a short message. And those of you who are looking at the volume that I was passing it around, he has a great chapter at the end. He interviewed a lot of Professor Zureik's students and old colleagues to kind of give a rich picture of his intellectual life. So he builds on that in this short message. Then I hope we'll have some time for the discussion at the end.
Good morning. My name is David Lyon. I was at Queen's University with Elia Zureik. He was my colleague there for many years, from 1990 to 2015. And we'd actually corresponded from 1985, and we did co-author an article in 2022, which makes our relationship last 38 years, which is by far my longest collegial relationship. I'll leave you the details that others will tell you, but as far as I'm concerned, I was especially interested in his work on Palestine, and then as it developed, our work together on surveillance. His magnum opus, the Israel's colonial project in Palestine, Brutal Pursuit, that came out in 2016, was indeed crowning work of his career. And he showed in there that Israel's building a surveillance-dependent occupation was crucial to its maintaining control over the indigenous population that was never given serious opportunity to form its own state. Elia made lots of visits to Israel, Palestine, and other neighboring countries, teaching, researching, and collaborating. And he was always discussing and engaged with the future of Palestine. In the early 1990s, he was engaged with the ill-fated Oslo Accords and indeed continued to write about Palestinian issues until his death at age 84. At his funeral, his family members reflected on how their young lives included many vacations that were actually visits to war zones and centers of tension and crisis, but they had no complaints. At the same time, Elia was concerned with research on, for example, workplace surveillance and workplace computing in general, and also related questions to do with law and privacy. In 1993, we planned together the first ever surveillance studies workshop to be held at Queen's, and it drew together a couple of dozen researchers that we'd never met. And then as that work expanded, together with Yolan Chan in the School of Business, Elia and I initiated the surveillance project that became the Surveillance Studies Center, obtaining increasingly large grants for collaborative and international research. Let me tell you about one of those situations. We included a focus on Israel and Palestine that had culminated, as it turned out, in one of the most thrilling and emotionally charged research workshops that I've ever been involved in. We held it in Cyprus so that Middle Eastern and North African colleagues could easily attend. Israel and Palestinian scholars met to discuss surveillance in a palpable atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, anxiety, and apprehension. Some participants from Israel, Palestine, had never actually met the other. Amazingly, after 3 days together, there were, of course, still some disagreements, but much mutual understanding had been forged. And we all went for an after-dinner swim from the beach in that hotel. Whether Elia actually joined us for the swim, I can't remember. But the book that came out of that, which we edited with Yasmin Abu Laban, who was the co-organizer of that particular event, is called Surveillance and Control in Israel-Palestine, Population, Territory, Power. I owe so much to Elia for helping me to understand Israel-Palestine, for advising me at many points, but particularly when I was invited to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, or to teach at Birzeit University in Ramallah. And he had a warm collegiality. He was sometimes hidden behind a grumpy exterior, but I knew him well. And he was held in high esteem too by many graduate students, especially those who, like him, were displaced or marginal. He was respected by colleagues not only in the social sciences, but also in computing sciences, engineering, mathematics, and so on. After retiring, he helped to found the establish the sociology department at the new Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. Appropriately, colleagues plotted together to make a Festschrift for Elia, which came out in 2024, Decolonizing the Study of Palestine, Settler Colonialism after Elia Zureik, a well-deserved Festschrift. Elia's primary interest throughout was the fact that he was born as a diasporan Palestinian. Once, when Edward Said was giving a lecture at Queen's, Elia introduced him. Before starting his own public lecture, however, Said told the audience, as I recall, words like this: "I hope you realize how lucky you are to have someone of the caliber of Elia Zureik here. He is one of the most brilliant analysts of the Palestinian problem, so-called, that is alive today. And he was always open to discussing with Israelis as he was with Palestinians. His involvements with Oslo are a clear sign that he sought for peaceful and just solutions. And this is, of course, something that we all hope for, pray for, and believe in. So thank you, Elia, and thank you for your attention this evening.
Well, he was an academic, and most of the time he was focused on his books and his research. But I can say, personally, when I first heard about Palestine, and he must have given this to me, I was against ethno-national religious organizations, whether they were in Iran or Saudi Arabia. So I was probably influenced by his views, but also by actually what was happening way back in the 60s. I don't know. He spent most of his time with his books.
If I may, I think in the United States, there were the natives, Native Americans were allowed to be integrated into American system as individuals, and in fact, some of the chiefs of the local population were integrated into American political system, became politicians, and some of them. But in Palestine, if you are not a Jew, you can't assimilate. And therefore, the option of assimilation is not there. You can be any kind of person in the United States and become an American. Yes, and in fact, anybody just getting into the United States, becoming citizens, he is an American. I remember once I was in a taxi from the airport to Colombia, where I was visiting, and the taxi driver was curious about my accent, and I said, and he asked me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "In America, everybody is American." And it was enough for, it was the end of conversation. He can't challenge that. But in Israel, if you are not a Jew, even if you're Jew and you are not Israeli, you are part of the collective. And if you are Palestinian, you can't be part of the collective. And I found in internal discussions by Israeli leaders after 1948, they debated the question, what should we do with these Arabs? And I think I mentioned that in my book on the military government, and they said that first we should expel them, we should wait for another war. We can't expel them without war. We should try to attack other countries, Syria basically, and to expel them. But then when they realized after a decade or more that these people are not going to leave the country, they will stay here for as they said, the foreseeable future. And they said they can't be accepted as equal citizens. They will always remain at the margin of Israeli society and the labor market. And therefore, integration, let alone assimilation, is not part of the deal, it's not offered.
And that's why we don't know what the future holds.
Areej, if you want to add, we can hear you, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro, for this important question about the way Elias looked at, if he saw about assimilation. I think through reading Elias' work from internal colonialism until his book on settler colonialism, among the latest ones, I think that Elia, as Ahmed said about how Ahmed perceived settler colonialism in Israel-Palestine, that Elia's focus was on the exclusion practices, the material and the symbolic elimination of Palestinians through different projects. Actually, I'm reviewing currently Elia's work on crime and the intra-communal violence inside the Palestinian society from the mid-80s, when the phenomena wasn't that catastrophic like today. His thought or his analysis, I think specifically living in Canada as a settler colonial country and navigating within the literature in the US and Canada, he realized that the project is not assimilation because Israel is exclusively Jewish, and the idea of integrating the indigenous is not a question at all. So it wasn't in his line of thinking about this project as assimilatory, because it is from the beginning was actually very clear that this project is not.
If I just may add another thing, I think settlers, they don't like natives and they don't want to exclude, and therefore the assimilation is only in specific cases has been sought out as an option. For example, in Algeria, if we look at Algeria as a good example of settler colonial setting, where the Algerians, in fact, had to choose between being a Muslim and the French. You can't be a Muslim and French at the same time. Therefore, was the possibility of assimilation was not there, and only very few thousand of Algerians took this offer and relinquished their identity as Muslims. And also I think in Australia, there was elimination of the natives without the option of assimilation. And I'm not aware of another setting other than America, and to some extent Canada, that natives were offered an option of assimilation. And therefore, of course, in South Africa, there was no option of assimilation. And therefore, I think only in specific cases where this option was open to natives.
He did everything, but we left before the Summer of Love in San Francisco. But I have to say, he knew every color and type of person and was critical of, but supportive of people who he agreed with their values of life. And it didn't matter, some of them were gay, some were Jewish, some were, he was pretty inclusive.
Thank you.
And it was just an era in time, and that was what I was trying to explain to people. We did go through an era of time that not many people are left to, when we mention those names, that have experienced.
If I may add to that, I'm sorry if I just may add to that if we look at his studies, in fact, he went to these rebellious milieus, and his ideas were forged by being part of, I would say, a wider movement of third worldism, of black civil rights, and so on. And he went to universities, and in Britain, I know that because I studied there. I studied in the United Kingdom, that Essex University is part of these new universities, which brought new ideas, a kind of fresh kind of knowledge and atmosphere to the world. And he was there at that time. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge or these elite universities where they aim to sustain the picture of the world, of that colonial world, but went to university, Simon Fraser, and I met some people from Simon Fraser. But Essex, I know Essex University, particularly, is that it was one of these new universities in Britain which changed the intellectual culture in Britain.
And I think, was that the place where they bombed Barclays Bank? Or they, I don't, I mean, it could have happened there. I mean, it's just crazy stuff was going on in these universities when we were there. That is a good question because we haven't brought up the Arab world.
The question to me.
So I pass that one to you.
Okay, I think in the Arab world, as all over the world, there are the elites, there are those who try to keep their position and their privileges, and they are wary of, or they are antagonistic to the new ideas. For example, you mentioned that Elia went to AUB, American University of Beirut, and in fact, American University of Beirut was the hub of radical thinking and radical social movements in the whole of the Middle East. And a lot of universities were established in the Arab world to fight that tendency, because young people went to AUB. It was a place where they exposed to revolutionary theories, revolutionary ideas, and the regimes were unhappy with that. And we saw, you know, they're trying to not to send young people there. And it's not surprising that Elia went there.
No, his father.
And his father.
That was, yeah. So it was a lineage of.
Yeah, it's a history of, lineage, exactly. And in the Arab world, I think, as in other places, there is also this struggle between the people who have the money and people who have the power, who are aligned with the West, and the mass of the people who are opposed to that. Part of the people who are opposed to that, because they see what's going on. You know, for example, the generation of my parents, you don't have to tell them about the Nakba. They lived the Nakba. And now that there are these kind of elites who try to suppress everything and to be part of the West and so on, to align their interests with the West, and to look at the West as their idea, the idea of the West. In fact, I had an interesting conversation with an Arab professor at one of the leading Arab universities, and I asked him about why do they continue to teach these theories of colonialism as if they are the absolute truth, and why they are overtaken by this Western knowledge, and why haven't they developed a critical thinking toward this knowledge. And he told me, when they saw, I am just repeating what he told me, which was really a bit offensive. He told me if a blonde guy with the green eyes come to them and tell them anything, they would take it as the truth. And this is what they want to believe. And they have the power, they have the support of the West. This is exactly the colonization of the mind, which is, I think, we spoke about settler colonialism and so on. And I think probably one of the most oppressive forms of colonialism, the colonization of the mind. And this exists in many colonies, and in the Arab world, there are people who just captive minds, just repeat what the West says. And I participated in a workshop in Qatar, and most of the participants were Americans, and mainly American professors. And there was a Saudi guy, young guy, and he was overtaken by this kind of conceptions and American theories and so on. And he said that the United States should keep its bases, military bases in the Gulf, because if the Americans withdraw, there will be a vacuum, and then another power will come in and colonize or dominate the region. But we want the Americans. And I really was struck. What about the people of Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia, they have many millions there. How comes that it will be vacuum, and even they all the time purchasing these American weapons and so on? And what about the people? Look at the Palestinians. They are unarmed civilians and so on, and they keep resisting the most powerful state in the Middle East. Why should the Saudis need the American bases and so on? But anyway, this is the colonization of the mind.
But may I ask, did the Saudi offer to bring the American bases to Saudi Arabia? No. Last time they did that, they had big problems. Anyway, yeah.
Any last words, Professor Sabbagh-Khoury?
Yes, thank you, Asmat, and thank you about the question. I think the question of the Arab scholars, if we don't want to essentialize Arabs and Palestinian and talk about them as one block, we can look at the differences between this group and the circumstances that they're living. If we are thinking, for example, about knowledge production in Syria during al-Assad, and how scholars resisted the hegemony. But it's not just the issue of elites and etc. There are compound and different voices that are coming from the Arab world. And I think it's important for us to think and write always and correspond with them, given the importance of the local knowledge that is produced about these different places. So I think it's very important that we don't essentialize, but think in the different positionalities and the ways and forms. And also there are Arab intellectuals and scholars in the West and the East. So the question, the one who asked the question, I didn't hear clearly. But if you ask about the Arab scholars and the Arab thinking, in which language, because also part of it was translated. So it's a compound situation that I would also interact with and learn from and criticize and engage with. But and a final thing about Elia's thoughts on assimilation, I want to flip your question, Alejandro, and talk about the way Elia also corresponded or related to settlers, and especially Israelis. As Mary mentioned, the way he is in his thinking and thought and work, he also never closed the doors for a conversation, but it was in a conversation from a powerful point, from realizing and from being an indigenous who's looking at the products of the settlers. So it's not just the question of assimilation, if we want to flip the point in Elia's thinking, but in the way how he produced knowledge about the settlers, about the state, about the hegemony, and about their project. So this is my take also on this. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Sabbagh-Khoury and Professor Ahmad Saada and Mary Zureik. Thank you all for being here. I know we're a little bit over time, but I appreciate you all coming. I just want to make a note that next week on Tuesday, April 1st, there's another excellent event hosted by Hearing Palestine at University College, UC 179. It's another book launch for Ma'an Hamad, a great Palestinian photographer, featuring Stephen Shiha, who is the foremost historian of Arab photography, and the great Iraqi photographer Tamar Abdelhadi, who is actually the Jackman Humanities Institute artist in residence. So I hope you all can join us there. You can check the Hearing Palestine website for details, or write to me if you have any questions. Thank you again for our guests.
Thank you.